Welcome to Deep Dive Podcast, episode number 5. Today we're taking a deep dive into a topic that, well, touches many lives, but is often surrounded by a lot of judgment and, frankly, misconception. We're talking about the impact of pornography. We've gathered your articles, research, notes, and our mission today is really to cut through the noise. We want to offer you a clear, evidence-based look at how it affects our brains, our relationships, and, our overall well-being. We're aiming to move beyond assumptions here, focusing just on what the research actually tells us.
Yeah, it's definitely a sensitive area, and I think approaching it impartially is absolutely key. What's clear from the sources is that it's a really multidimensional picture. The impact isn't simple, it's rarely black and white. It really seems to exist on a spectrum influenced by, well, a whole host of different factors.
Okay, so let's unpack that right away. Is pornography just inherently harmful to a relationship? Because our sources seem pretty clear. There's no simple yes or no answer here. Some couples, maybe surprisingly to some, actually use pornography together, as part of exploring things sexually, and they don't report harm. So that brings up the big question. If it's not always harmful, when does use cross that line? When does it become, well, problematic?
That's exactly the distinction the research makes. It differentiates between non-problematic use and problematic consumption. Problematic use, essentially, is when pornography starts causing real issues in other parts of someone's life. The harm, it seems, often comes not just from using it, but when it begins to substitute for real intimacy, or maybe when it's used to avoid vulnerability, or that deeper emotional closeness with a partner.
Ah, okay. So it's less about the what and more about the how and why it's being used in someone's life and relationships.
Exactly. And what's really interesting is how pornography often portrays this, well, exaggerated or idealized version of sex, doesn't it? Bodies might seem flawless, reactions are often theatrical, and the focus is so much on performance, maybe spectacle, rather than genuine connection. Over time, this can start to distort views on real-life relationships. It can create these unrealistic expectations about how people should look or desire or, behave sexually. Now, people turn to porn for lots of reasons. Sometimes it's just curiosity or maybe stress relief or boredom, but for some, it becomes more of a coping mechanism, right? Maybe during times of loneliness or anxiety or low self-esteem, it acts as an escape from difficult emotions. And it's when that kind of consistent, maybe excessive reliance develops, that's often where we see that shift towards problematic use.
Right. Okay, here's where I think it gets really fascinating. How does something like pornography actually change our brains? What's going on neurologically when someone engages with this stuff?
Yeah, to really get that, we need to talk about the brain's reward system. It's often called the mesolimbic dopamine system. And this is a really primitive, super powerful network in our brains. It's designed to motivate behaviors that are essential for survival. Things like eating, drinking, bonding with others, and yes, sex. Now, dopamine. A lot of people think of it as just the pleasure chemical, but it's actually more accurate to call it a motivation or maybe an anticipation chemical. It's the brain saying, pay attention, this is important, go get it, do it again. It's what drives us to seek out rewards.
So it's not just the pleasure itself, but that really powerful urge, that drive to go after the pleasure.
Precisely. And in a natural setting, this system works great. A good meal, finishing a project, consensual sex, these things trigger a moderate, healthy dopamine release. It reinforces good behaviors. But internet pornography, well, it introduces what researchers call a supernormal stimulus. Think of it like an exaggerated version of something natural, something that triggers a way stronger response than, normal everyday encounters ever could.
And what is it about online pornography specifically that makes it such a potent supernormal stimulus?
Well, a big part of it is what some researchers call the AAA engine. Accessibility, affordability, and anonymity. It's accessible 24/7, right? On your phone, your laptop, just a few clicks away. A lot of it's free, which removes that financial barrier completely. And crucially, people can view it in private. There are no immediate social consequences. So this unprecedented ease of access, combined with an almost endless variety of new, often extreme content, it creates this environment where the brain's reward system can just be hit again and again intensely. Our brains are wired to respond strongly to novelty, and online porn offers this near infinite stream of new faces, new scenarios, new fetishes. This constant novelty, it keeps those dopamine levels artificially jacked up. And over time, the brain can actually become desensitized to these constant high levels. This leads to what we call tolerance. It's a bit like with substance use, actually. People might find they need more extreme stuff or need to view it more often just to get the same level of arousal or satisfaction they used to. It creates this pattern of escalation.
Wow. Yeah, it sounds like a treadmill that just keeps speeding up, demanding more and more just to stay in the same place reward-wise. So what are the actual, measurable brain changes that studies link with this kind of chronic compulsive use?
Well, the research points to several key things. First, there's dopamine dysregulation and desensitization. Those repeated, really intense dopamine spikes can lead to what's called a downregulation of dopamine receptors, especially D2 receptors, in the reward pathway. Basically, the brain becomes less sensitive to dopamine's effects. And as a result, things that are normally rewarding hobbies, hanging out with friends, even sex with a partner, they might start to feel less appealing, less satisfying, because they just don't provide that same intense dopamine hit the brain's gotten used to. This can lead to something called anhedonia, that reduced ability to feel pleasure from everyday things. And paradoxically, the cravings for porn can actually get stronger as the brain tries to get back to those high dopamine levels it now expects. Understanding this biological side of things, I think, can be really helpful in reducing shame. It shows it's not just about weak willpower. There's a real biological shift happening.
And are there actual physical changes, to the structure of the brain itself?
Some studies, using neuroimaging like fMRI, that's functional MRI, which measures brain activity through blood flow changes, have suggested potential structural differences. For instance, some research has found correlations between how much time people spend viewing porn and maybe reduced gray matter volume in certain areas, like the striatum. That's a key part of the reward system. Other studies have noted altered functional connectivity, how different brain areas talk to each other between parts of the reward system and the prefrontal cortex.
The prefrontal cortex, that's the decision-making part, right?
Exactly, yeah. The part involved in executive functions, decision-making, impulse control, judgment. Now, it is really crucial to add a big caution here. Correlation does not equal causation. We see these links, but we can't definitively say porn causes these changes based on this research alone. More research is definitely needed to untangle those complex relationships. But these findings do suggest that high levels of consumption are associated with changes in brain areas that are critical for how we process rewards and control our impulses.
Okay, so how do these biological changes translate into difficulties in the real world, like with self-control or making good decisions?
Right. Well, that connects to what researchers call impaired executive function. That prefrontal cortex, sometimes called the brain's CEO, is responsible for those higher level things: planning, judgment, resisting impulses. Chronic overstimulation of the reward system seems like it might impair the PFC's function. So this could show up as, difficulty resisting urges, maybe poor judgment, or challenges with emotional regulation, like getting really irritable if someone can't access porn when they feel the urge. And on top of that, the brain's stress systems can get thrown off balance too. Think about the cycle: craving, compulsive use, then maybe feeling guilty or ashamed afterwards. That can create a chronic stress state. And over time, the brain might become more sensitive to stress, which then makes the person more likely to turn back to porn as a perceived way to escape or cope, reinforcing the whole cycle.
Wow. Okay, so let's bring this back to, us, our lives. What does all this mean for our relationships, for our own sense of well-being? What are those ripple effects when porn use does become problematic?
Well, problematic use can really undermine trust and intimacy in relationships, sometimes profoundly. When there's secrecy around it, a partner can feel deceived, maybe emotionally abandoned, even if the person using porn didn't intend to cause harm. The hiding itself is damaging. Communication often breaks down too, right? Maybe there's discomfort or shame on one side, or perhaps fear and guilt on the other. And that stops people from having open conversations. It leads to distance. It weakens the connection.
And those unrealistic expectations you mentioned earlier, how do they fit into the relationship dynamic?
Yeah, they can really cause problems. Those often unrealistic portrayals of sex can make both partners question themselves, feel inadequate, or just feel disconnected from what's real between them. One of the sources shared a really powerful story about a woman who found out her husband was secretly viewing porn. She described feeling shocked, hurt, and even disgusted. And when she tried to talk to him about it, his reaction, dismissing it like, "Oh, all guys use porn," that just made the divide even deeper. It's a tough story, but it really highlights that rebuilding trust isn't about making excuses or minimizing feelings. It takes empathy, real honesty, and a shared effort to understand each other.
That makes sense. And beyond the relationship, what about the individual? What are the psychological impacts we see linked to problematic use?
There's quite a strong association with various mental health challenges. For instance, a 2020 study found links between compulsive porn use and higher levels of depression, anxiety, and stress in university students. This affected both men and women, although the anxiety effect seemed potentially stronger for men in that study. Another study from 2022 pointed to a correlation with emotional dysregulation, so difficulty managing feelings effectively. We also often see individuals struggling with lower self-esteem, feelings of shame, intense guilt. Interestingly, a 2023 study specifically highlighted a connection between increased porn use and body comparison issues, and even higher rates of eating disorders in men. And then there's the impact on real-life intimacy itself. People report losing interest, decreased libido, even erectile dysfunction, which seems to be increasingly noted in younger men. There was a quote in one of the sources that was quite stark: "Sex is great, but it doesn't compare to porn." That really shows how real intimacy can lose its appeal for some, and the impacts can spread even further into other life areas. Some psychologists mention patients losing jobs because they couldn't stop looking at adult sites at work, apparently. Surveys suggest about 25% of working adults admit to doing this. Financial problems can also crop up.
Okay, this paints a pretty challenging picture, but it leads to, I think, the most important question. Is there hope? Can people change? Our sources definitely point towards the brain's amazing ability to adapt and heal. What does that mean for someone struggling?
It means there is absolutely hope. A tremendous amount, actually, thanks to something called neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity is just the brain's incredible lifelong ability to reorganize itself. It forms new connections between neurons, it prunes old ones, all based on our experiences, learning, even injury. You know the saying, neurons that fire together, wire together, that perfectly captures it. So fundamentally, recovery from problematic porn use is a process of retraining the brain. It's about harnessing that neuroplasticity.
Okay, so how does someone actually do that? How do you harness neuroplasticity for recovery? What are the practical steps the sources talk about?
Well, the first step, and it's often the most critical one, is abstinence. Some people call it the reboot. You have to stop the behavior that's constantly overstimulating the reward system. This gives those dopamine receptors a chance to recalibrate, to sort of reset. Over time, with abstinence, natural rewards can start to feel genuinely pleasurable again. The next big piece is developing new, healthy habits, actively engaging in things that are naturally rewarding: exercise, hobbies, maybe mindfulness, getting out in nature, fostering real social connections. This helps build alternative, healthier pathways in the brain. You're basically carving new routes. Then, practices like mindfulness and cognitive restructuring are really vital. Mindfulness meditation, for example, helps people become more aware of thoughts and urges without just automatically acting on them. It creates a bit of space for conscious choice. And techniques from cognitive behavioral therapy, or CBT, help people challenge the unhelpful thought patterns that often drive compulsive behaviors.
Right. And what about dealing with those really strong urges or cravings when they hit?
That's where managing triggers and cravings comes in. It involves learning to identify your personal triggers, what situations, emotions, or even thoughts tend to lead to urges, and then developing healthy coping strategies to deal with those triggers without resorting to porn. Every time someone successfully navigates an urge using a healthier strategy, that new pathway gets stronger. And finally, maybe especially important for relationships, is building healthy relationships and intimacy. Actively putting focus and energy into real-life connection, real intimacy, helps rewire the brain for those genuine relational rewards, moving it away from relying on artificial stimulation.
That makes sense. But if trust has been broken, how do couples even start having those really difficult conversations about porn use?
Yeah, that's tough. Honest, non-judgmental conversation is just essential. The sources really advocate for expressing feelings clearly but carefully. Using I statements is often recommended, like, "I feel distant when," instead of blaming language like, "you always." And then it's so important to actually listen without interrupting, to try and understand your partner's perspective, even if you don't agree with it right away. The goal is mutual understanding first. From that place, couples can start working on setting some shared boundaries that feel right for both of them. And look, if the conversation just keeps getting stuck or leads to constant conflict, seeking professional help like couples therapy is a really good idea. A therapist can help navigate those tricky issues and support the rebuilding process.
It sounds like the real core message for relationships is about prioritizing that deeper emotional connection.
Absolutely. Lasting, healthy relationships are fundamentally built on emotional intimacy, that feeling of being safe, seen, truly valued by your partner. And often, when couples really prioritize strengthening that emotional bond, the physical intimacy tends to improve naturally alongside it. If porn is being used primarily as a substitute for that vital emotional connection, it really risks making the distance in the relationship even wider. It's also worth mentioning quickly that problematic porn use often goes hand in hand with other mental health conditions, things like anxiety, depression, OCD, maybe even PTSD. So, a really comprehensive recovery plan often needs to address these underlying issues too. That's sometimes called dual diagnosis treatment. And the sources do mention various therapeutic options, individual counseling, which, as you know, can often be done online now for privacy support groups, and also 12-step programs like Sex Addicts Anonymous can be helpful for some.
What a deep dive this really has been. We've covered a lot of ground exploring this complex topic from, the brain science, how it can potentially hijack our reward systems right through to the very real impacts on relationships and individual well-being. But I think the central message, the thing that really stands out from our sources, is one of hope and maybe empowerment, just from understanding the science behind it all. So what does this all mean for you listening right now?
I think it means that just understanding how the brain's reward system works and how it can be impacted by these supernormal stimuli can actually reduce a lot of the shame and self-blame people feel. It highlights that struggling with this isn't simply a failure of willpower. There are complex biological processes involved that can be influenced. And most importantly, the brain isn't fixed. It's not set in stone. It has this incredible capacity for change, that neuroplasticity we talked about, which means that with conscious effort, by cultivating new behaviors and with the right support, people can genuinely participate in rewiring their own brains for, hopefully, lasting freedom and more fulfilling lives. And perhaps a thought to leave you with. Considering the brain's powerful innate drive for novelty and reward, how might we, both as a society and just as individuals, consciously work to cultivate environments and relationships that naturally provide that deep, sustained satisfaction and genuine connection? The kind that problematic supernormal stimuli seem to promise on the surface, but ultimately really can't deliver in a lasting way.
Thank you so much for joining us on the deep dive. We really hope this knowledge serves as a valuable tool for your own self-understanding and well-being.